and good afternoon from the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. Thank you for making it through the rains on this early monsoon type day. Supposedly the rainy season is not supposed to come for another month or two, but you could have fooled me this morning. And we're here to talk about the issue of cybercrime, cyber scams, and with particular focus on Cambodia. My name is Phil Robertson. I'm the program committee chair at the Foreign Correspondent Club and the director of the Asia Human Rights and Labor Advocates. And before we get started, I just want to say a few things about upcoming events at the FCCT. One of the privileges of being an FCCT member is you get in free for all events. You also get 20% off on food and beverage, so it's a pretty good bargain. And we encourage people to consider joining the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand. Our events come out every Monday. There's a bulletin that's sent by email. You can sign up for that for free. This evening, we're going to have a trivia night at the FCCT, so get your team together and come over. It's a lot of fun. We usually have quite a few teams come in. Next week, we have two events. One is primarily for overseas Americans. The Democrats Abroad Thailand is having its annual general meeting here on the 22nd. That's a Thursday, starting at 6:30 p.m. And on next Friday, the 23rd, we're having a new photo exhibition opening, Democratic Jungle, the Invisible Struggle of Workers Who Power Our World. This is a very talented photojournalist, Nathalie Jamois, who's going to bring her photos of migrant workers in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand, to the club. We'll also have a panel that will feature Nathalie, who will be talking about the world that she sees, as well as several other panelists, including a member of parliament and also some humanitarian workers who are working with migrant workers. Today, we're going to be talking about the very important issues of cyber scams, something that affects Thailand directly, and as we will hear, affects not only that, but the region and the wider world. We're lucky to have Jake Sims here, who's going to release his report that he has been working on. It's been a labor of love, quite clearly, talking about state-abetted transnational crime in Cambodia as a global security threat. Briefly, Southeast Asia's transnational cybercriminal industry is perhaps the most significant economic force in the entire Mekong subregion, and it may be equivalent to as much as 40% of the GDP in some primary host countries. Those institutes come from UNODC and the U.S. Institute for Peace. This panel is composed of experts not only in transnational crime and human trafficking, but also the cyber scam centers, particularly as they operate in Cambodia. And so we're going to first hear from Jake Sims. Let me just briefly introduce Jake. He's a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Asia Center. He's an advisor to various government agencies, think tanks, and NGOs working to address transnational crime, rights, and security issues in Southeast Asia. He's been working on these issues for approximately 15 years. In 2021, he was living in Cambodia leading a labor trafficking project as this whole issue of the cyber scam center has exploded. And he's been at the forefront of the global response as it's unfolded over the past several years. He's also someone who contributes analysis and commentary to various different outlets, including The Diplomat, where he has a monthly column. So we're first going to hear from Jake. He's going to explain a little bit about his new report. This is Policies and Patterns, State-abetted transnational crime in Cambodia as a global security threat. You can speak to him about getting a hard copy, but of course it is also available online. And Jake, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Phil, and the whole Foreign Correspondents Club for welcoming this event, inviting it, and actually being a significant part of my journey into this space after finding myself unwantingly in Thailand in 2022. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here. And like Phil said, I'm going to present a little bit of the findings of this study. I'm not going to go into an extreme amount of depth because I am joined up here by actually 3 of the people that I most enjoy hearing speak about this issue. And so I want us to all get a chance to talk about this. But I'll just give a little bit of an overview on what this study is, how it came about, what the methods were that I employed, and what some of the key findings and recommendations are that emerged from it. So I do have a couple of hard copies, but my funder for this report met an untimely end about midway through the process. And so if you would be kind and grab a digital copy, then everyone can have a read. I only have a couple, unfortunately. So this study emerged actually from USAID Cambodia's project. Let's see if I can move to the next slide. If not, I'll just do without slides. That's all right. And basically, they were wanting me to look at 3 core questions of what are the drivers that have led to Cambodia being a major host country for transnational cybercrime in 2025, 2024. What some of the key barriers have been to countering that industry in the country, and what might be useful in terms of a more comprehensive policy response to that status quo, given some of the constraints. And the study emerges from sort of 2 primary data sets, the first being a normal sort of scholarly policy literature review, years of actually OSINT work that precede the beginning of the study, and also 51 interviews with a range of leading experts on the space, diplomats, international observers, local journalists, international journalists, scholars who are writing on this issue, and notably also survivors of the crime type itself. And I think these 2 sources provide as a pretty good picture of the landscape of sort of dominant opinion on the issue as it is emerging, but it is absolutely emergent literature and an emergent topic, and so there are some key gaps. And one of the most notable gaps in the planned approach to this study is a glaring absence of representation from the Cambodian government in the respondent set. So in the study design, we had planned to have 10 to 15 interviews with key government officials and had recruited a Cambodian affiliate researcher to be a part of that. But unfortunately, shortly before the interviews commenced, that researcher was arrested on charges that are widely believed to be related to his reporting on this issue. And so in the end, we did not, my research advisory council advised that it would not be ethical, given what we know, to continue trying to proceed with a Cambodia-based affiliate researcher, which also then unfortunately meant that the perspective of the Cambodian government ends up being limited to their demonstrated actions on the issue. So that is a key constraint. The other key constraint is that actually a plurality, a majority of the interviewees for this study expressed at the outset pretty significant security concerns about their involvement. And so that has necessitated a pretty significant anonymization of the findings, which I think takes a little bit of the color out of the analysis. It also means that the way that the data was recorded didn't allow for more systematic analysis of some of the qualitative findings, just because a lot of the respondents actually directly requested that I not take notes, that I not record, that I not have sort of affiliate researchers involved as well. And so there is, it has lessened the richness of the data on some level. Okay, those caveats aside, I'm actually, instead of, I hope, this is pretty small, so I'll probably just walk through this. This slide actually is speaking about, before I get into the actual findings of the study emerges from a set of starting points that is not precisely controversial, but it is unprecedented and unusual given the size and rapid expansion of this industry, and that is a couple of key points. First, that transnational fraud now rivals the global drug trade in terms of gross global revenue and also gross global reach. That is something that's, I've cited The Economist for that. They've done a whole feature issue on this topic and why that claim is sort of imminently defensible. But that's sort of starting point one. Starting point two is that the epicenter of that industry globally right now is this region, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos. Phil rightly said that this is considered now to be one of, if not the primary economic engine in the Mekong subregion. And in those three countries, the estimates actually range somewhere between 40 and 60% of the equivalent to 40 to 60% of the GDP in those countries. So the third starting point is perhaps more arguable, but I guess the basis of evidence that I'm looking at defends the claim that Cambodia itself is actually the true epicenter of this. It is clearly rivaled by Myanmar, but in terms of both the labor force, the revenue being driven, and also the service industries that support and uphold and drive this across the region, it's the finding of this report that Cambodia is the epicenter, and if it is neck and neck with Myanmar today, I think that there is strong evidence to suggest that moving forward, this is the country that is most well positioned to be the market leader, so to speak, for years to come. And I'll get into that a little bit more before I turn it over to my co-panelists. But those estimates are arising from expected revenue figures and labor force estimates that have been cited by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I leverage, so the number of $12.5 billion a year has been thrown around for about 3 years on Cambodia's, the size of Cambodia's industry. That is leveraging a 100,000 person labor force estimate. That's not saying trafficking victims, we'll get into that a bit more down the line, but labor force overall. There was some new research that actually goes more granular and I think is more credible than the 100,000 number by USAID's counter-trafficking in persons program before they were closed in late 2024. That actually ups that estimate to about 150,000, and that is off the back of local research that has identified 350 compounds amongst others that are suspected compounds, averaging about 300 people per compound, though compounds range from 20 to 30 people to 15,000 people. But this slide is basically just a mapping of that, and just wanted to give that sort of up front before we get into our discussion about where this sort of, if you're just approaching this issue, these sort of grandiose claims about the size of this issue, they are coming from significant research over the past few years. They are also undoubtedly rough estimates. And so they're a starting point, but they're a generally accepted starting point. What is not really up for debate, and I would say maybe the first and initial finding that I think maybe frames the rest of this conversation is across every scholarly source, every policy source, and 51 interviews, I obviously got a very rich and diverse array of opinions about the drivers and mechanisms of this industry. One thing was absolutely unanimous, and that was that the core central driver of this industry in Cambodia is endemic systematic corruption and state involvement. And I almost hesitate to use the word corruption because the sort of scholarly consensus is actually that the Cambodian government throughout its reign, the Cambodian People's Party over the last 40 years, has actually principally used a series of extractive, predatory, and outright criminal industries as a way of securing the loyalty of the security services in the country, the military, the police, the people that in highly corrupt, decadent, venal sort of ruling strategies generally conduct coups and overthrow governments. They actually, within Cambodia, the government has been quite effective at ensuring the loyalty of those sort of security coercive apparatus. And they have been able to do that because of the extremely high profit margins of these illicit industries. And effectively, so I have a quote up here, more evolution than revolution. When this industry came to prominence in 2021, 2022, it certainly supercharged that dynamic, but it was in no way a novel political development. And you'll see that as we go through this discussion, as if you read through the report, it's actually a lot of the same actors that were involved in gun running and tobacco smuggling and illegal land reappropriation and illegal timber trade and on and on and on over the decades. It's the same principally culpable actors that were involved. Yeah, maybe that's all I'll say on chapter 1. So chapter 1 sort of lays out the enabling environment, which is this highly vertically integrated state-embedded criminal nature of this industry as a key driver that actually is sort of consonant and extends very much into the prevailing ruling strategy of the Cambodian People's Party for the last 40 years. I'm not going to spend as much time going through the other chapters. I'm already closing in on 10 minutes. Chapter 2, though, we've talked about so far the pull factors that have brought this industry into Cambodia. There are also push factors from around the region that I think Jason will talk a bit more about in his comments. Based on reforms in other countries around the region and also, you could say, hegemonic aspirations, you have seen a diffusion and some of the interviewees actually called it an importation of criminal talent to Cambodia and some of the other governance-poor countries across the region. And so chapter 2 discusses some of the nuance, particularly focusing on China's role, both as a disruptive force, because China certainly has been the most disruptive force to Cambodia's industry, but also a key enabler of its existence. And so how do we look at those two things in unison and with nuance, is sort of what chapter 2 talks about. Chapter 3, if there's nuance and ambiguity on China's role, there is absolutely no ambiguity about the role of the gambling industry in Cambodia as a key driver and facilitator of this, or of Cambodia's financial system, which is effectively today operating as basically a hollowed out vessel for criminal patronage interests, this one being one of the most prominent. So chapter 3 goes into depth about what I call the tools of the trade, but the gambling, the telecoms, the financial industry, as well as Cambodia's remarkable development on physical infrastructure, vis-a-vis some of the other key host countries that has allowed it to maintain a comparative advantage. Chapter 4 talks a little bit about civil society's relationship to this. Interviewees generally characterize, and I'll talk about this later in the discussion, as the civil society response devolving into sort of a story of two communities. The international community, which has been rendered largely impotent due to its relationship and reliance on relationships with compromised officials, and then the local civil society, which has taken more of an oppositional stance to the Cambodian government. These are local journalists, human rights organizations that have actually, despite significant repression, funding gaps, et cetera, driven most of the evidence base and the legitimate response up to this point. Cambodia sort of has a storied, deteriorating situation of closing civic space. This industry has absolutely, and the emergence of it has catalyzed and accelerated that trend. And so it's a pretty bleak picture, but if we hope to continue responding well to this, we're going to need to find a way to fund and support those people. The last chapter, and I'll stop here, I will not get into my core recommendations, but the last chapter I called Kleptocratic Mechanisms, and effectively making such a significant claim about the primary aim and strategy of an entire government. I have sort of anticipated and actually also been overwhelmed by the breadth of how that actually plays out in practice. And so one of the contributions of this study is an offering of an initial comprehensive taxonomy of what that actually looks like on the ground. What are the actual mechanisms of state involvement in this industry? What are the functions of that involvement? Who are the principally culpable actors in that involvement? And then where possible, publicly cited. examples of each of those. So I've identified 9 functions of state involvement in the industry and then 64 different mechanisms, sort of mapping out in a more comprehensive and transparent way exactly what this looks like. I'll maybe just say it's a rough sketch. It was done, it was not the primary aim of the study, but it felt like something, given the findings, that was sort of justified and sort of needed as we continue trying to figure out how do we actually approach a situation of such a profound state crime nexus as that we're seeing in Cambodia today. All of that ultimately rolls up into a recommendation that there is a need for a coordinated posture of harm minimization relative this state crime nexus. I'm not going to go into that in depth now because I'm like 13 minutes. I told Phil I'd stayed at 10.
You can have as many minutes as you like.
All right, so we'll take a brief intermission, and then maybe I'll kick it back to Phil, and I can touch on some of the more targeted components of that high-level recommendation later on. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that summary. I was looking through Appendix B of those mechanisms, and it's quite chilling. It's very comprehensive, and so I mean, you're skipping right to Appendix B of the report. You're like, whoa, oh my God.
And maybe I will say one other thing. When you look, if you're going to get to Appendix B, don't skip over Appendix A, which is
the names, yeah.
Which is basically another thing I was quite struck by in the respondents was the insistence that because of the profound gap in accountability within Cambodia, that there is a pressing, urgent need for international accountability on this topic. That was, I guess, another key finding of this, and in my notes, I started to become overwhelmed with the number of people that were actually listed by respondents. And so Appendix A is actually a list of all of the names that were alleged by my respondents to be sort of culpably involved in this industry and meriting international accountability mechanisms. So sanctions, travel bans, visa bans, indictments where their crimes are crossing borders. It doesn't quite amount to a formal recommendation from me, and certainly not from my funder. I've been asked to say that also, but from the respondents who I have anonymized. So take that for what you will. But Appendix A and B sort of go hand in hand. These are the people that are alleged to sit at the top of these, state crime mechanisms and functions.
No, I mean, from my perspective, it's just refreshing that you're actually naming names. Because, I mean, too often we get a lot of reports where, like, oh, everybody knows who we're talking about, Yeah,
the FCCT is also sponsored armed security for me when I leave the building, so thank you for that as well.
Yeah, Dum Doubles is the security officer. Okay, so we're going to have some comments from the panel as well. Actually, I'm just going to, the panel, we're very lucky to have such esteemed experts, and you'll understand who they are when I give an introduction for each of them. I'm going to introduce them, all three of them, to start, just to get that out of the way, because they're very, very senior and very, very well established in terms of expertise on these topics. First we're going to hear from Jason Tower, who's sitting here. He's got over 20 years of experience working on conflict and security issues in China and Southeast Asia, focusing most recently, especially on the conflict in Myanmar and transnational crime. He's done a lot of cutting-edge research on criminal enclaves that are hosting these type of cyber scam operations that we're talking about in Southeast Asia. He's published a number of reports highlighting the involvement of Chinese origin criminal groups, and he is a Chinese speaker, so that helps quite a bit because he really gets behind the scenes of what's actually happening. He's published more than 24 articles about the situation in Myanmar and the Myanmar coup, including on regional security in Asia and also on the rise of these transnational criminal groups in Myanmar post-coup, but he's also been involved looking at Cambodia. We're going to then hear next from Lindsay Kennedy, she's a Cambodian-based investigative journalist and a research director of the Eyewitness Project. She leads the reporting and training on links between organized crime, corruption, and underreported conflicts around the world. And actually, since 2021, she's focused on the monitoring and mapping of the global scam compound crisis, including the underlying criminal networks, money laundering operations, and linked criminal industries from gun smuggling to environmental crime. She's worked on reports for a whole number of very important organizations, including the Global Initiative on Against Transnational Organized Crime, Brookings Institution, the United States Institute for Peace, and MAG International. And she's done a lot of briefings for embassies, various international policymakers, NGOs, and written a lot of articles for The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, South China Morning Post, and others. And then finally, we'll hear from Mark Taylor. Mark Taylor was the chief of party of the USAID counter-trafficking in persons projects in Cambodia that was implemented by Windrock International from March 2021 until it was unceremoniously shut down with the rest of USAID-funded projects in April 2025. He's got 27 years of experience working on human trafficking issues and related issues within government and the development sector, including 10 years between 2003 and 2013 when he was serving as the U.S. Department of State's senior coordinator responsible for annual production of the State Department TIP report in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking Persons. That report, of course, we're all waiting to see what's going to come out under the current administration. It may be a little less than expected. So first of all, I'm going to just turn to Jason and ask sort of what are some of the primary factors that have driven the emergence and now dominance of transnational fraud as a political economic force in the region, obviously with your expertise in China, but then also looking at what you've seen in Myanmar as well.
Sure, thanks, Phil. And first off, just to strongly recommend that everyone read the report. There's a lot of very valuable information in there, and that it lays out some excellent policy recommendations for addressing this. And I think the subtitle of the report mentioning this as a global security threat, for really addressing that global security threat, some really important recommendations in there. In Jake's comments, I think he mentioned a bit about China's role as a disruptor and enabler, and talked also a little bit about the connections between online gambling, casinos, and the scam centers. And so I'll try to fill in a little bit more of how we got to the point where these transnational criminal syndicates are able to perpetrate crimes on this scale across the region, including both scams that now pose a security threat to basically everyone on the planet, but also equally as much the human trafficking side of things, where you're seeing now, and I think I have the latest numbers, just coming out of Myawaddy in Myanmar, there's already been 38 countries' nationals that have been repatriated recently, and I'm sure we'll get to some of those points shortly as well. I think the starting point for how this evolved is the fact that gambling is illegal in China, as is online gambling. And so you've seen, I think, throughout history that there is a very large market for both traditional brick and mortar casinos as well as for online gambling. And as soon as that technology was available, even going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, you saw where almost immediately many Chinese crime groups moved into that illicit market. And of course, as would be expected, you saw that Chinese police began to respond to that, to crack down on that. And the natural thing, and I think this kind of parallels the patterns that you've seen with traditional casinos, where a lot of those individuals involved would operate junkets or operate other sorts of mechanisms to bring Chinese out of China into casinos in northern Myanmar, northern Laos, other parts of the region and beyond. You saw where suddenly there was a large outflow of Chinese who sought to set up online gambling operations across Southeast Asia in countries that might be hospitable to them having a presence in those countries. And part of that was these webs of largely actors who would be seen as illicit actors back in China. They began to move out. They began to go into places like the Philippines, northern Myanmar, Laos, and effectively set up mechanisms whereby they could ideally operate online casinos targeting Chinese nationals legally, or at least build out protection networks in order to be able to ensure that they could engage in that type of activity without having to worry about Chinese law enforcement coming across the border after them, or local law enforcement going after them, as China might potentially put pressure on law enforcement in those countries. So you saw where this grew very rapidly. Gambling, online gambling, is a $40 to $80 billion per year market in China. And so you saw where these online gambling syndicates were both tapping into one of the biggest markets in the region that really only they had access to. And they became, quite innovative at moving money. Right, they built out all sorts of mechanisms for moving funds outside of China, because at the end of the day, you need to get people in China to put money into online gambling accounts, and then you need to get those assets somewhere where they'll be useful to you based overseas. And so you started to see this consolidation throughout Southeast Asia, where the influence of Chinese involved in online gambling operations across the Philippines, Myanmar, Laos, and extending by 2016 in a big way also into Cambodia became larger and larger. And in fact, it's estimated by around 2016 that you had in the range of 500,000 Chinese nationals operating across the region. Now, of course, at that scale, you're already starting to see a lot of competition, right? I mean, if you've got 30,000 online gambling platforms, at some point, how do you distinguish yourself? How do you market to a new Chinese audience in order to get more people addicted to gambling? And so the method really became to set up these sophisticated marketing teams that would use all kinds of unconventional tactics to get people ultimately addicted to gambling and to get them to fund those accounts. And so you started to see that a lot of the mechanisms for doing this would just simply be one of the online gambling operators would hire a team to go out on common Chinese social media platforms and try to entice people to gamble, befriending them, sometimes maybe even building romantic relationships with them. And so you saw kind of, as this progressed, that they built more and more capacity in that area. By 2016, the first emergence of the pig butchering scams appeared. And basically what someone saw, what they got the idea was, well, if you're doing online gambling, it's already illegal back in China. You've got Chinese police coming after you already. Potentially your ability to build new market share is difficult. What if instead of getting that marketing team to offer an online gambling platform, you instead offered an investment opportunity? You could easily get someone to put a heck of a lot more money into something that looks like it's lucrative. It's generating a sizable profit. And that really, I think, was the birth of the pig butchering scam in the Chinese-speaking world around 2016. And so since then, I think you've seen where that's taken off. You've seen where this network that's been built across the region by all of these online gambling operators, it's become hybrid in many ways. And you'll see that many of the compounds, the older compounds in particular, in places like Sihanoukville, Shui Koko, and Myanmar, they were designed initially for online gambling, but gradually you started to see it's a mixture: online gambling, online scamming. The gambling really did give birth to this sophisticated form of online scamming that has proliferated across the region. And again, if you put those illicit markets next to each other, you're still seeing tens of billions per year in online gambling. You're seeing tens of billions also in the online scamming. This is a huge amount of money that is being laundered overseas, and it enables these actors to put those funds into a wide range of industries, reinvesting it into other markets. And I think it's no surprise that if you look into Jake's report as well, you'll see quite a bit of information in there about some of the companies and other assets that those who have been benefiting from both the online gambling and the online scamming are putting their funding into. So I think it gives a little bit of history, and of course, if we can have more time, we could go into what happened during the pandemic and how this became a global issue, because I think it was really, once again, policies in China that triggered this to become very much a global issue of concern. During COVID, when China called its nationals back, you suddenly saw where that 500,000 plus population of Chinese involved in gambling and online scamming was gutted, and there was a need for other sources of labor. And so shift to kidnapping, shift to recruitment scams to trick people in. And really, I think at the same time also, as the scamming started to become more and more on the radar of Chinese law enforcement, you also started to see where by 2021, China began a crackdown on cryptocurrencies, which again, that crackdown and ban on cryptocurrencies in China was another factor that triggered this massive infrastructure that had been set up and that had been scamming Chinese to suddenly pivot to start scamming the rest of the world. So I think one of the other conclusions we can draw from this and these developments is that this has also led to China-linked crime groups becoming the dominant crime groups in the region, more so than some of the more traditional transnational criminal actors that you would see from other parts of Northeast Asia also operating here, or local gangs in the region. But what's also happened is that the Chinese groups, there's been a lot of learning and sharing back and forth, which involves webs of Taiwanese crime groups, it involves webs of some of the other Northeast Asian crime groups, but also local crime groups are adapting this methodology, and you're seeing where there's been a pollination across different crime groups, with many of them all converging on online scamming, as it's one of the most rapidly growing and most lucrative of the illicit markets in the region.
Very worrisome. And against that, particularly in Cambodia, you had aligned a various number of groups and organizations and journalists who were reporting about what was happening in Cambodia. People like Mek Dara, who is a journalist who now has stopped writing in the result of threats. So I actually wanted to ask Lindsay, who just come over from Cambodia and is based there. She said, "Can you give us an idea of the current state of play for civil society in Cambodia? What's the situation they're facing? I mean, and are you actually able to operate there, given the kind of aggressive reporting you're doing?"
Yeah, I mean, there's been a concerted effort since at least 2018 to shut down all society really in Cambodia. Pretty much all free press in the country has been gradually shut down. Reporting in country has ended up being very much the realm of freelancers, some of whom have now been arrested, ejected, murdered at greater numbers. I think my ability to operate has a time limit too. Ultimately, I think anyone who's covering this at scale probably has a time limit for how long they'll be able to stay in the country. But for now, for now, the people who are working on this are trying their best. Like Jake was saying, a lot of people have to work anonymously, which is obviously weakens sometimes how evidence base that you can offer when you report. A massive problem though for journalists especially is that these organizations have become so powerful. Like some of the groups that are running scam compounds also have enormous real estate businesses, they have enormous development companies, they have a lot of money. So it doesn't matter where you're reporting in the world, they will sue that paper and they will get you shut down. And the amount of my work that has been killed in the last couple of years is insane. Obviously, if you're a freelancer and your work gets killed, you don't really get paid anything for it, so you can work for months on something at incredible danger to yourself, potentially a danger to everyone who's helping you, and then you can end up in a terrible financial situation as a result of your work being cut. So the fact that this follows you, you're working in a country that has very effectively shut down any ability to cover what they're doing in country, and then can follow you anywhere in the world to shut you down there too, is I think the most frightening aspect of this. And which is particularly depressing because, if you're looking at a country like the UK or Australia, for example, these are two major areas that are being targeted for scams. So huge amounts of money are being stolen from these countries, transferred into the hands of these criminal groups, who then use them to shut down your media in your country and then buy up loads of real estate there. So the amount of capture, the amount of control and power this process is giving these groups well beyond the borders of Cambodia or Myanmar or Laos or the UAE or the major countries they operate in is absolutely terrifying. And I just also like to say, Jake mentioned this before about the about corruption and using this word corruption. I think what is absolutely terrifying is that this is not corruption, this is the status quo. If you have a serious conversation with anyone who's a police officer or someone in the military in Cambodia especially, they will happily tell you that the entire, every major criminal industry is run top down. I mean, if you're a police officer in Cambodia, you know, you can't expect to earn more than maybe $100 a month. You can sell your position to somebody for 30 grand. Why is that? It's because you can make so much money on the side from working in illegal industries, right? And so this issue of scams is so enormous and so entrenched because everyone along the chain is making money out of it. Everyone is getting paid. And to be honest, if you shut it down at this point, like overnight, the economic hole that would leave in the country is so enormous that a country like Cambodia might fail. So yeah, it is such a huge risk to allow civil society to undermine this or report on this, that it is so in the interest of countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, UAE especially, to prevent any form of serious investigation, that I can't see that changing.
That's very worrisome. I mean, I know that, I think the cousin of the current Prime Minister, Hun To, I think he sued the Australian.
Yeah, he's currently suing Al Jazeera as well.
He sued the Australian, and the Australian settled with him, right?
Yeah. And often the thing is, a lot of this stuff won't get fought enough because at the end of the day, an editor's like, is it really worth us going under for a story about Cambodia, even though it's not really just a story about Cambodia, it's a story about a transnational, incredibly powerful criminal organization that's going to harm you in your own country too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say that it actually shows how the drivers of this also extend to the countries where this, what is effectively transnational repression, is occurring. So Hun To has been able to operate in this way in Australia because he's able to sue media outlets and not be exposed until there's actually a settlement for having done that. So I was talking with a colleague last night about this is basically a legal harassment that is happening behind the scenes because of the way the Australian legal system works. And also his standing to sue is predicated on the fact that he has leveraged his proximity to power and he's never held like a real job, and his family all command government salaries in the $900 to $1,100 per month, but he's leveraged that to use laundered money to purchase multiple properties in Australia that then gives him standing to sue and intimidate journalists in that country. And so that's that both there's anti-money laundering failures in the Australian system. There are sort of legal loopholes that are being exploited by the kleptocratic elite from these countries that are basically undermining not just Cambodian local civil society and freelancers that are working there, but also legitimate, massive, large sort of journalistic outlets that are operating in the countries that are also the victim countries of the crime type that's perpetuating the regime. So it's very encompassing.
The UK, and in like countries like the UK as well. Even if you make a completely frivolous suit that can't go anywhere, it means that the lawyers can get hold of your home address and then give that to the people that are suing. So basically, incredibly dangerous criminal organizations and traffickers can get hold of like home addresses of people that are investigating them like that just by opening a frivolous suit. So it's very dangerous for everyone to be reporting on them.
Yeah, this is what people are not aware of the term. It's just strategic litigation against public participation, or SLAP suits, which Thailand has a major problem with, but it's a problem across the region. Did Hun To get his Australian visa restored, or is he still barred?
I think he's still barred, and that ultimately was the grounds he used to likely sue the Australian and these other outlets. So. Right.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn a little bit to Mark here. Until the obliteration of USAID, you were actually at the epicenter of both funding and coordinating efforts to respond to this issue. Could you talk about some of the landscape of the response to the issues raised in this report, both pre-cuts and then post-USAID cuts, and what were some of the key challenges you faced also as someone who had to deal on a regular basis with this Cambodian government?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Phil, and thank you for the FCCT for hosting this. Also, thank you to Humanity Research Consultancy, our absent partner, who supported the release. It's great to see this report out, particularly given the unexpected curtailment of funding that led to its temporary halt, but glad that it's seeing the light of day. This 4-year project that I was managing in Cambodia up until a couple months ago is timed almost exactly with the rise of online scamming in Cambodia at scale. As Jason quite rightly noted, this has been around the region for at least since 2016, certainly in the Philippines, mainland Southeast Asia, but it really took off in Cambodia in the post-COVID era, and also because of a rule from then Prime Minister Hun Sen to criminalize online gambling facilities. So as we started up this project and saw this taking off, we could see that civil society and government were both going to be very challenged, and indeed were. But the government made a quick divergence from the two communities that Jake's talked about, CSOs and the internationals, by first not acknowledging at all the problem. It just didn't exist. That was ultimately unsustainable, and by the end of 2022, as the chair of ASEAN, the government finally admitted that there was a problem. They would try to address it. There were some performative moves, a minor crackdown in Sihanoukville largely towards the end of the year. But we could see that the trafficking situation was fundamentally changing in the country. It was going from a source country to a destination, and the number of people being recruited under fraudulent and forced conditions was already in the thousands, source countries numbering in the dozens, violence rising, torture rising, and yet the government's reaction was really very minimal. At the same time, and this is over those years of 2022, 3, and 4, the premium put on information on what is behind this, who are the players behind this, how is this coming about, how is it just even working, was really underscored. And very few people could report on it at the time. You've heard about the tightening of civil society. That made things all the more difficult. Voice of Democracy, which had been playing such a crucial role in the initial reports that brought this to the world's attention, was shut down in February of 24. Later, Mekdara, the superstar journalist of VOD, arrested towards the end of the year. It's become very difficult to try to get anything that approximates tactical information on who's behind this and how it's operating. So this report is terrific in coloring in a lot of what we struggled with over the last 4 years, explaining the drivers, why we were so frustrated in our works, our day-to-day collaboration with Royal Cambodian Government authorities, particularly the police and the NCCT, the National Committee to Combat Human Trafficking, which has been around since 2016. In a traditional anti-trafficking project, the relationship between the donor and ourselves as an implementing partner would be quite tightly tied to the government. And indeed, we were walking into this with partnerships on both sides, civil society and the government. But that quickly fell apart as this online scamming threat emerged, and goodwill just seemed to dissipate. And this is in stark contrast to the trafficking problem that Cambodia has seen traditionally. Sex trafficking within the country, sex trafficking to China, bride sales, labor trafficking within the country, and also to Thailand as the major destination, and places like the Gulf. The government, to some extent, responds to this. There was a modicum of commitment, and we could find a common ground. And I say we in a big we, not just my project and my donor, but others working in the same field. That suddenly was no longer the case. And it's been extremely difficult to understand why even the most basic facts can't be agreed on. Some problem, that it's human trafficking, that this is not voluntary, this is not an investment scheme, this is not a labor migration issue, and it's not an immigration crime. So this is where the report is just invaluable in showing that with this scale of profit, this 12.5 billion to 19.5 billion requires a huge level of official complicity. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I do want to just highlight a couple things in addition to both what's in the report and a little bit that's outside of it. The Cambodian, what I call the exceptionalism of Cambodia in this industry, online scamming. You look in the region, we've talked about the Philippines, Myanmar, and Laos. And in those three other countries where we see, heavy concentration of scamming sites, that scamming is limited to a geographic or economic sector. For example, in Laos, it's in the Bokeo Special Economic Zone called the Golden Triangle Zone. In Myanmar, it tends to be more in the autonomous ethnic areas of Karen and Shan State, although of course there are large exceptions to that. In the Philippines, it's confined to the POGOs, the Philippines offshore gaming operations, which are mainly in the Metro Manila, the Manila Metro region. In Cambodia, it is everywhere. Every single province of the country has registered with at least one online scamming facility. Those 350 that we estimate really now are dispersed everywhere. It started with concentrations in Sihanoukville and then places like Bavet, Hoi Pet, but has emerged in the middle of Phnom Penh, within a stone's throw of the Ministry of Interior's new building, in Kampot, in the middle of rice fields in Kandal province. And the more worrisome trend in the last year, than I think Lindsay knows more of, is the rise of new construction, purpose-built online scamming operations that are appearing in places where generally investment is taking a bit of a hit, mainly because of China's slowdown. But this is booming. New construction, new operations, and all of this is, of course, accessible to the government. There is no agreement, like in a special economic zone in Laos, to grant limited autonomy. Police stations in some cases are they're right next door to scamming centers. There's no rationalization, no legitimate rationalization for why these cannot be better addressed. And yet, 4 years later, we haven't seen one significant violator arrested, prosecuted. One center closed down long term, and I'm thinking about the 10 that were temporarily closed down in Sihanoukville in 2022. So what I like, there are many things I love about this report, but I like the recommendations because in our world of human trafficking, some look at countries like Cambodia and say, well, the real impediments here tend to center around capacity and resources, and that, at first blush, seems reasonable. But in this case, we've been down this road. We spent 4 years. The project I managed put significant funds into training the police for 2 years, and the evidence from that action was that this does not pay off. This is not making any progress. I mean, literally zero progress. So there is a clear, pathway of facts to underscore a different approach, to move away from resource transfers like training, to move away from emphasizing capacity development, which has been done for decades in Cambodia, and to look at what Jake refers to as harm minimization. And how do we minimize the impact on global security that this is having, regional security, negative security impacts to Cambodia society itself, through innovative means, some bilateral, some multilateral, ways that we can better tap the media and civil society. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask one last question, which is to have Jake go through some of those recommendations in detail and talk about what he thinks needs to be done. But I also note that we have a microphone at the back of the club. We're going to be taking questions. I think we're going to run probably till about, well, at least another 15, 20 minutes or so. So if you have questions, think about those now while Jake gives us a little bit more about the recommendations of the report and what needs to happen now.
Sure, and I'll also note there is a noted non-Cambodia expert on this panel, and so if you have questions about what's happening in Myanmar and Laos, feel free to direct those at Jason. There will be no offense taken if there's interest in those countries.
Or you can ask a question too. So I mean, the Myanmar stuff is really important for Thailand as well.
It's very important. It's also very important, as Mark noted, it's very important for understanding the exceptional case of Cambodia. And I like that Mark used this word exceptional because there's actually in the literature about organized crime and governance and how we understand where these things exist. There's a term called exceptionality that's often used, and basically used to describe areas where crime groups are able to perforate through traditional governance structures, whether through conflict or special economic zones or rampant corruption, and find ways to embed themselves where the state no longer functions. And what Cambodia, the case of Cambodia in this actually is breaking that mold. Because of this phenomenon we tried to describe earlier, where yes, this the characterization of a shadow state, which is often used to describe Cambodia, does exist, but in reality, the shadow state, so to speak, is actually the one that everyone sees. I described institutions in Cambodia, and they frequently are described in this way as hollowed out vessels for patronage, but they actually serve a more strategic purpose than that. Yes, the example Lindsay gave of police needing to make money through corruption just to make ends meet, yes, that exists, but institutions also exist explicitly for the purpose of distracting and manipulating international attention into what Mark sort of described as performative. It's often described as pretend reform mechanisms. And so in reality, if you're looking at the scam industry and its relationship to the Cambodian state party apparatus, there is no shadow state involvement. This is the state. This is the mechanism of state action, is to perpetuate this industry so that it can perpetuate itself. And that is very, very unique within the region. And it's actually very, very unique historically, because generally countries that are involved in this level of state-involved crime do not have this level of durability that the Cambodian People's Party has clearly shown over the last 4 decades. So I'll just say that, because it's very sort of important when we're looking at what sort of response internationally could be helpful. It's important to, and this was repeatedly emphasized by my interviewees, the sort of pivotal nature of looking at and approaching the Cambodian government with open eyes and with clear eyes. People used willful blindness and donor insecurity, suspended disbelief, sort of to describe the way that the international community generally postures itself towards Cambodia, and that certainly has been emblematic in this space, but it's also not unique to this space. And so in terms of looking at the international response to date, you have sort of two dominant modes. One, I would say, is more the diplomatic approach that is sort of best, most effectively and astutely proffered by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and a lot of their analysis on this work, which has added significant value to our understanding of the crime type, but finds its limitations in its member state orientation. And I think there's actually, you look at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime actually produced a really excellent report called Inflection Point a couple of weeks ago that adds enormous new value to our understanding of the criminal enterprises, but looks at Cambodia as an equal partner amongst other partners in the region, and a partner that there's an underlying assumption that good faith can be expected. And that, I would say, is sort of an evidence, like if you're looking at things from that perspective, you are operating from a position of suspended disbelief relative this country. And that's not to discount the need for a more diplomatic response, because if we're able to minimize harm and impose costs well enough, it should redirect countries back into that strategic frame, which is sort of like a norms-based way of looking at regional governance, which I'm not trying to undermine here, but that approach in and of itself is not going to be sufficient when you have a country that is so holistically and systematically and structurally compromised in the way that Cambodia is. And so the other type of response that you could look at is more of a disruptive one that is looking at, the term I use is minimizing harms that are coming out of the state cybercrime nexus, but ultimately looking to identify areas of mutual interest amongst other state and non-state actors relative to what is coming in Cambodia, and that could be private sector corporations that are experiencing significant exposure due to the risks coming out of the space. It could be states that are having significant populations trafficked, states that are having significant populations experiencing financial fraud, that are incurring transnational repression that's sort of impinging on their own state sovereignty. Thailand would be sort of chief amongst those countries, but we've noted Australia and others as well. So identifying mutual interest, finding ways to undermine and delegitimize state criminal propaganda that's coming out of countries that clearly have a strategic interest in propping up this industry. Mark talked a little bit, he didn't use those words, but when you look at Cambodia's National Committee to Counter Trafficking, it's almost like the emblematic, it's very emblematic of that mode of response, where you have the chief counter-trafficking officials in the country repeatedly defaming victims, obscuring the nature of the crime, calling this labor disputes and immigration disputes, foreign criminals, investment schemes, basically sort of best-in-class obfuscation of the issue at play. So finding ways to delegitimize that. The report gives a lot of examples of how to do that. We also need to find ways to constrain the profitability of the key perpetrators. And so when you look to what's been done there, I think the best example would be the U.S. Department of Treasury that has in recent weeks sanctioned Wei-1, or not sanctioned Wei-1, but listed them as a primary money laundering concern. It's actually even elevated beyond a sanction. That's quite a notable development in the space. For those who know what Wei-1 is, won't go into that here. The report talks a lot about it. There's other Inflection Point also gives great insights on Wei-1. But also Treasury sanctioned K&A, Chit 2, his sons, and initially actually Leon Pat, who is a very, very powerful actor within the Cambodian political and economic environment. Within an environment like Cambodia, ultimately, if sanctions are going to be effective in practice and in purpose, they're going to need to be done not in a unilateral fashion, but in a coalitional, multilateral fashion. Certainly, I'm not going to oppose sanctions that are coming out of Treasury if they're not able to get people to come alongside. But this is going to be much more effective if done in concert with other countries that have expressed strategic interest in seeing this industry constrained. And apart from that, it is largely a signaling mechanism. So a sanction against someone like Leon Pat, just from a single country, is a landmark policy move. I don't want to discount that in any by any means. It was the first meaningful sanction. The UK government had done some sort of, I would call them performative sanctions against not local elites, but more like obvious organized criminals that are very difficult to hold accountable. That's a starting point, but for a local elite that is easily identifiable and doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver, this was a first, and sort of a notable advance in the space. But likely, the biggest impact we could have expected from that would have derived from the signaling mechanism that the US government would have been sending to the Cambodian government that we see what's going on here. Obviously, to get a sanction with that level of political exposure likely required significant interagency collaboration and political will generation within the US government. But I think it's an interesting, the reason I'm sort of harping on this point, it's an interesting case study of how that action, as potentially catalytic as it could have been, actually undermined itself in some regards. It was never translated into Khmer. It was never publicly endorsed by the embassy in Phnom Penh. The outgoing ambassador actually made some comments that seemed to undermine the sanction itself, almost sort of apologizing for it. And so this is not to blame any specific actor, but to say there appears to be some lack of strategic clarity about the intent and purposes of sanctions like this. And there's going to need to be more clarity and more strategic framing if we're going to actually be able to hold these actors accountable. Because effectively what happened weeks after the sanctions, and this is analysis from the Ministry of Commerce's database in Cambodia, all of Leon Pat's corporate holdings, both those that were sanctioned and those that were not, vanished. And that is the only word that you can really use to describe it. They weren't delisted, they weren't barred, they didn't experience any censure. They just disappeared from the corporate register, and voices on the ground will unanimously confirm all of those businesses still have the lights on. So this is high-level state-assisted sanctions evasion, and this is exactly what could have been expected. And so just to reemphasize, the signaling mechanism and the delegitimization that comes from sanctions is a really, really, really important part of what we can hope that cost-imposing approach to deliver. And so it's incumbent on states that are considering sanctions to think about how do we make sure that our messaging and our strategy is aligned. So the last point that I will say on harm minimization extends beyond individual culpability and towards the culpability of these systems. And it has to do with what mechanisms do we have in place to undermine the money laundering side of this. And ultimately, the biggest one of those is the FATF mechanism. So it's a watchdog organization of large countries that has the ability to require extended due diligence to be done by the financial sector. There's gray and black lists. Notably, Cambodia maneuvered itself off of that listing in 2023, just as this industry was coming to prominence. And that is another strategic comparative advantage that it wields over Laos and Myanmar. Myanmar, I believe, is a blacklisted country. Laos is a gray-listed country. No such safeguarding on the Cambodian context. It's sort of like maybe a really low-hanging fruit area of adjustment, but also the FATF process more broadly is rather black box. It's very difficult to understand what factors were considered. No civil society was consulted in the process. It appears to be that the government was able to put together a performative checklist to get themselves off of that listing. And so those are maybe some areas of the cost imposition side of harm minimization. And then I'll close, and we can open it for questions by saying the other real key recommendation emerging from this is, because of the nature of the response, because of the reality that the vast majority of evidence we have on this industry today in Cambodia has emerged from locally based, highly repressed, extremely underfunded civil society, if we hope to preserve that, we need to find ways to, one, integrate those voices with international accountability measures, certainly, but to do that, we're going to have to give them security, capacity, funding, space to operate, basically, if we hope to see this, basically, if we hope to have continued information that is not coming from the criminal hosts themselves, that the world can use to hopefully counter this space moving forward.
Thank you. Okay, we're now going to open for questions. Please introduce yourself, and if you represent an organization, state that as well.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Sally Jensen from the AFP News Agency. Really appreciate your time. This question is kind of to anyone who would like to answer it. To kind of touch on the China issue, I mean, Cambodia politically is one of China's biggest allies in the region, and right now they're holding joint military exercises. And so what I want to know really is, surely if China is trying to clamp down on this issue with, certain court warrants, against actors like Prince Holdings Group, for example, how does the CPP, how does the Cambodian government align that with its kind of laissez-faire attitude to these criminal networks that one of its closest allies seemingly seeks to eradicate?
So my comments on this are fully articulated in chapter 2 of the study, and so I want to defer to my colleagues on this one. In sum, I think it's it requires some nuance to address that, but I'll defer to my colleagues here.
This is something of an obsession for me, but just in a very general sense, China has had a lot of impact in Cambodia at getting Cambodia to shut down scam compounds that target Chinese people. And part of the reason that China has so much influence is because China doesn't pretend, like everybody else, that Cambodia, the Cambodian government, police, etc., are actually sort of like helpless neutral parties in this, and maybe they could just offer them some help strengthening their ability for to investigate. They act as if they are in control of the situation, and they demand shutdowns. And when they demand shutdowns, they often get them. And what's happened instead, though, is that a lot of scam compounds that used to house groups that would target Chinese people now just target English speakers instead. So, and obviously that's not, China doesn't care whether or not, why would it, whether or not other people are being scammed. China has leveraged a lot of power. I do think what is really interesting in Cambodia, we were talking about this earlier actually, is that Cambodia is amazing actually at playing off all the different people that are interested in it. And it has at times refused to deport people, refused to play ball with China in ways that if China really pushes it, it would actually reveal the limitations of their power in the country. So everyone's playing this kind of delicate dance of sort of asking for just enough without actually crossing a line where it would be embarrassing for them to say that Cambodia refused, is kind of my take. But also, Cambodia, China's a massive country, right? And you've got lots and lots and lots of individual provincial leaders, very corrupt sometimes provincial leaders and powerful business people from different areas, and they're capable of forming their own political links within Cambodia. And that's often what's happened. So you often have people who are very powerful, let's say in Yunnan province, who come over and set up a kind of scam center compound empire in Cambodia and pass themselves off as being linked to the central government in China. And by the time that's sort of become obvious, I think, to Beijing, it's quite embarrassing to admit that happened under their watch. So I think there's a lot of delicate sort of maneuvering going on, but ultimately, yeah, China is the only country at the moment that has enough influence and wields it to ever get anything changed in Cambodia when it comes to scam compounds. But
maybe just to add a bit on this, I think there's also several factors of how China can find this useful for its own positioning, not only with respect to Cambodia, but with respect to other countries in the region that have gotten deeply involved in providing protection to the scam syndicates. Of all things that China might demand Cambodia to do, really the only thing you're going to see pushback on is on the scam center issue. And I think you've seen repeatedly, just going back to the COVID time when China put out, for example, the movie No More Bets, that's really the only thing that Cambodia has ever lodged diplomatic protest towards China around was, hey, don't talk about our scam centers. That's kind of a red line. So I think transactionally you could see where, okay, if China wants Cambodia or other countries in the region to do a little bit more to advance other aspects of its interests in the region, if it wants them to do something that might undermine ASEAN vis-a-vis China, that might harm interests of maritime countries when it comes to South China Seas, when it comes to Mekong issues, control, dominance over the Mekong region, you'll see that China can actually use this issue to gain leverage and to extract concessions in other adjacent areas. So I think that that's one thing that really countries in the region need to take stock of. And you see it happening across the board. I think you see it happening. There's around also some of the dynamics that played out earlier this year when there was this sudden wave of Chinese being trafficked through Thailand, for example, where China put tremendous pressure on Thailand to do something and was able to extract some concessions in other areas from Thailand in a similar way. So I think that's another element of how this is playing out. Another aspect of it also is, to some extent, China's looking to demonstrate to its public back at home and around the world that it's doing something on these issues, right? And a lot of that is political theater. And I think much of it is seeking to shock and awe. And so all of these countries, I think, are quite willing to work with China in playing this numbers game. And just to give some examples of this, so Chinese courts heard cases related to 82,000 criminal suspects involved in online scamming in 2024. You had large numbers of cases that extended from Myanmar. There were over 2,000 cases related to Myanmar. Cambodia is also pretty high up there, around 400 of the cases related to individuals in Cambodia. And every single one of those cases has multiple individuals involved with it. You'll also see where there's a lot of publicization, and you see this almost every couple of weeks. Oh, another batch of people being repatriated back to China from Cambodia. So you can actually see where there's Cambodian involvement in a joint law enforcement narrative that makes it appear as if there's progress being made in addressing these issues. I think if you look, though, at the numbers, right, at 2024 compared with 2023, the number of people that China actually tried went up 26%, right? So it's consistently increasing over time. The volume of people that are being repatriated each year, it's bigger year on year, and the number of cases that the courts are hearing are bigger and bigger year on year. Nonetheless, though, I mean, if you look at spin and look at the narratives, yeah, you're seeing very regularly there's this steady stream of people going back, and it's as if, okay, the Chinese police can tell that story. Look, not only are these efforts trying to help keep people in China safe from the scams, but they're also being effective in bringing a lot of these criminals back to China from Cambodia. But you never really see, I think, as has been pointed out already, the higher level players. It's the individuals that have just been tricked across borders that end up being the ones who are brought out of scam centers and repatriated. Very few instances, and there are some notable exceptions in Myanmar, which we could get into if we have time to get more down into the Myanmar case. But I think generally speaking, in the rest of the region, it's largely these more bit players or individuals who really are victims, but not ever really presented as victims in the Chinese press.
Maybe I will just add one quick anecdote that sort of supports what Jason and Lindsay were saying. In chapter 5 of this study, I spoke to a source with connections to Chinese law enforcement that suggested during these performative raids in 2022, some senior members of the Cambodian government, who I articulate in the report, were approached by Chinese law enforcement saying, here, these are compounds where we have citizens being held. And the response actually ended up being, yes, we can get those people out. We need to give the owner advance notice, and it's $100,000 per compound. And so the nature of that sort of relationship, I think, is emblematic of this, as Jason said, anything but scams sort of response. Earlier on in the report, I think it's sort of re-supporting this perspective as well, was the note that actually both Chinese and several Western country governments were cited by respondents as having said, well, our law enforcement is running up against barriers going after Chen Zhe, who's an advisor to the prime minister, sort of he's called by the Chinese government in court documents as a notorious organized criminal. That actually law enforcement from multiple countries, including China, said, yes, we're trying to go after this guy, but we are worried about the stability of our relationships in Phnom Penh if we do. And so to me, I think that is very emblematic of this point that Jason's making, that it's sort of an everything but scams, but it's also evidence that this core central node of organized crime that extends out of the prime minister's family in Cambodia really remains in the driver's seat. And I think this is sort of maybe a counterintuitive finding of like the dominant view of Cambodia, that it is just a Chinese vassal state, full stop, but that at its core strategic interests, it is not the case that it has been somehow overrun by Chinese organized criminals who now call all the shots in Phnom Penh. It's much more the case that those actors have been co-opted into supporting the primary patrimonial resource of the ruling party. So I think that's an important distinction to make, because it does express the limitations of even what China's significant influence in Cambodia can bring to bear when it comes to challenging this industry.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jerry Flynn from Mongo Bay, based here in Bangkok after I'm no longer welcome in Cambodia. Just two quick questions. Firstly, I wanted to ask whether the sanctions on Lee Yong-pak in any way slowed, stopped, or otherwise impeded his involvement in scam compounds. I know from looking at his involvement in illegal logging, it did not stop his continued plundering of forests in Pasat province. And the second question I was going to ask is, the scams have proliferated in areas where you have weaker civil society. You know, we see in Philippines the situation is not as severe as in Laos or Cambodia or Myanmar. And so from a diplomatic point and for sort of international media, I guess what should be done to kind of draw focus back to these places where there is very limited civil society?
All right, I'll take first stab at that. So in domestically in Cambodia, there's no evidence that the sanctions had any impact whatsoever on his investments in scams, illegal logging, electricity monopoly, or otherwise. And I think that was to be expected. A unilateral sanction only can go so far. In terms of how it may be constraining his ability to do business, he has significant financial investments in Thailand, obviously, and elsewhere around the region. To the extent to which it's constrained that is harder to say. Like, how effectively will he be able to operate through proxies in those contexts, I think remains somewhat of an open question, but within Cambodia, no. In terms of like what can be done, I think effectively, my view is that in the long run, journalism like what you and Lindsay were conducting, what Dara was conducting, open, named, bylined, local to Cambodia journalism is on its sort of dying breath. And I don't see a significant course correction there. I would say on the civil society side, if we hope to protect and sustain journalism more broadly, the frontier Myanmar model for Cambodia, but likely not in Thailand because of the effective transnational repressive arms that they have, which is another comparative advantage of Cambodia's criminal industries vis-a-vis those of Myanmar, is just the SAC and their affiliate militias are just far less effective at repressing people internationally than the Cambodian People's Party. That's a sad reality for people who are trying to speak out about what's going on in Cambodia, but there are other places, I think funding proposals, et cetera, that are looking to stand up a sort of diaspora-based media outlet that leverages the rich networks that certainly still exist of hopefully well-compensated pseudonymous reporting, which that's the frontier Myanmar model for Cambodia, would be a really great idea if funding ever sort of reemerges on this issue. And it would not just help the scams issue, but it would help the illegal logging issue, organized crime and corruption reporting more broadly. So I think that's really important. I do think that there still remains space for quieter civil society and human rights type reporting and investigations that has been sort of the engine, in my view, for a lot of the good reporting that has come out about this. I will not name names or organizations for obvious reasons, but I do think that there needs to be greater creativity in how do we efficiently get donor funds to those people. Because at this point, and this is a direct quote, we don't need it in drips and drabs, is what sort of representatives from that community has said. We don't need $3,000 to go and write a 10,000-word report on one compound. That's not helpful. What's needed is flexible, sustainable funding that, because of the interests involved in these funders, should necessarily require greater integration with accountability measures that extend beyond Cambodia. But if we can find ways to do that and sort of get rid of top-heavy, sort of middleman sort of funders, and just find ways to credibly, obviously, we still need to have good donor due diligence, but to credibly and efficiently get money safely also to those organizations and sort of informal civil society actors on the ground, I do see some hope for their resilience in the longer run.
Okay. Other comments on that?
Just adding very, very quickly on this, I think, better documenting some of the big breakthroughs that we've seen in the Philippines on this, where reporting is able to continue on these issues, and where, for example, even the involvement of Hui Wan in moving ransom money for someone who was kidnapped in the Philippines, that's something that, Filipino media was able to cover, kind of helping, I think, other parts of the region, helping other actors get a better sense of what exactly is going on with these guarantee and payment platforms. Documenting that, I think, does help to make a case as to how the Philippines is a bright spot, how the Philippines might be able to offer, some of its experiences in dealing with these issues as a place where there is more space for media, where there is more space for civil society. And I think also the democracy element is another important lens to look at insofar as, what prompted the initial crackdown on POGOs and ultimate banning of POGOs was a shift in administrations there. So, really, I think looking more deeply into some of the resilience in the region is another important strategy to see how can that be leveraged to help in other places.
Yeah, just one last thing on that. There's a reason why Eyewitness Project is now registered in the Seychelles, for this exact reason, because we're you kind of, everyone's having to find more and more ways to make yourself outside of the sphere where you can be harmed by this, right? But generally, yeah, there's a reason why in the Philippines, which was a major hub, there has been successful attempts to actually end the industry, and that's because there's a very, very vibrant free press, like Jason was saying, and whereas the reason why you have the countries where this is completely endemic are the same countries where reporting is harder and harder. So, there was a rush of international reporting late last year, I think, when all of the crackdowns in the Golden Triangle were announced, for example, and then the attitude was, oh, but that's all stopped now. I thought that was all stopped. And then you go back and everything, I was there last month, it's just as bad as it ever was, right? But there's no one there constantly saying, no, look, I've got a photo of it. And so you kind of have to, I think there's a massive responsibility of international news outlets to take more risks and to be more supportive of reporting in the region, because they're the only people that are going to be able to publish this, definitely. But yeah, it is getting harder and harder, definitely. And individual journalists and civil society actors are having to take on more and more risk all the time.
Another question. There's people in line here. Yeah. Go ahead, Luke. I think you're next, Luke.
Sorry, mate. I thought you meant sit online.
Introduce yourself.
Okay, nice start. Luke Hunt from The Diplomat. Interesting panel, that's certainly. I've covered this story for a long, long time, in Cambodia for much longer. Can any of you speak to the factions within the CPP? And by that I mean it's very easy to say Hun Sen's family, the Hun family. Can any of you speak to Tia Ban, Sarkim, the former Interior Minister, his son who has a long-term relationship with Chen Ji from Prince Bank, who is now taken over as the minister, and where those lines actually go. Two other quick questions, one for Jason, I think. 2019, I think your numbers are pretty good, 500,000 plus left. My memory serves me right, it was 464,000 Chinese in Sihanoukville on legitimate visas, and they all left. There's an argument behind the lines in the diplomatic circuit in Phnom Penh that the Chinese deliberately left their criminal element behind so they could maintain a toehold in Cambodia. And then it just blew out. It went way beyond what they expected. And going back to Prince Bank, I think Chen Ji is an excellent example. Just those 2 points, if you can speak to them, please. And one other is, I'd really appreciate an update on Myanmar, the Thai crackdown, We had working numbers of about 10,000 people rescued before the earthquake. Then the earthquake happens and the story's just been dropped. And I'm heading up to Mason on Sunday, so an update would be great. Thank you.
All right, I'll take the factions myth question. So yeah, absolutely. You've laid out a couple of the the key, I would call them key nodes within a centralized, central monopolized faction. But effectively, yes, there is certainly I would say in a minority opinion within like scholarly and on the ground sort of sources on Cambodia, there being this idea of a faction, but a faction implies dissonance and disruption and likelihood for split-offs. It also implies that they are not necessarily subservient to the central node. So if we're like understanding, if we're trying to understand how the Cambodian People's Party operates as a state party, I think like theoretically there is only one node, and there's not a lot of evidence for factionalization. There certainly are key structural nodes within the central one, but I think trying to identify recent credible evidence of oppositional forces today is really, really hard to do. You mentioned, I won't go into the Taban sort of node, but from the Chinza and Sar Soka so these are, the Sar Soka is the son of the previous Minister of Interior, he's the current Minister of Interior. That is the sort of most frequently cited faction within the CPP. One of his central patrons is also one of the central patrons of the Hun family sort of faction, if you were going to call that. So Chinza both serves as an advisor to current and past prime ministers. He's involved in extensive investment projects with many of their sort of obvious key clients, and also the Sar Soka sort of node here. It also, I think it is much more, if you're looking at the Soka or Sar Soka faction here, I think it's more apt to look at them as playing a role within this structure, and it centrally and I think historically has been a role of the primary face of pretend reforms, performative reforms, which has allowed this narrative of factionalization to pop up. But I think I would say the dominant perspective, and we can talk if you want offline about where I'm drawing this from like a scholarly perspective. I'm looking mostly like Lachlan, Gottesman, Sopal Ear, this sort of perspective on Cambodian political history, but we can definitely talk offline. I think the most credible argument about Cambodian political organization would suggest that all of that coercive force is pretty well centralized within or controlled by Hun Sen and his family. I think the question remains, because there are these powerful nodes within that central structure, the question remains, as Hun Sen gets further and further from the center of the picture, will what is left of his family be able to as effectively coordinate and command the loyalty of those various factions that all clearly do have significant power, and what will then happen? But that is, at this point, like a bit of prognosticating soothsayerism, because it's quite clear that he's still sort of calling the shots to a very significant degree. And so I think that will be an increasingly important question, and that factionalization will happen, but I view it as more of a likely future state for Cambodia than a current state. But happy to chat more.
If I can just add slightly to that, it's basically Cambodia is completely dynastic, as you were saying. After the last election, everyone just all the major leaders just handed over to their sons or daughters. It was amazing. It was amazing to watch. To maintain considerable power in Cambodia, you have to have someone who is extremely high up, at least one person is extremely high up in government, someone who's extremely powerful in the military or police, and someone who's extremely powerful in private business. You have to have all three of those things covered. And there are only about 4 or 5 families that can really say that they've got all of that at a really high level. Those are the families that have to be continually appeased, including the Huns. And ever so often, there do seem to be kind of like niggles or power struggles, especially with the Tier family, right? But I think so long as everyone keeps getting fed, they're happy. There was like a moment after the last election when I think felt like there was a little bit of a wobble. They seem to have sorted it out. But yeah, I think after Hun Sen's death, that might change. But yeah, I think so long as everyone just keeps getting fed and has their income streams, then it will stay as it is for the time being.
Which maybe would say that narrative of factionalization, I think, emerges from probably historically a devaluing of the centrality of really high profit margin criminal industries like this one that keeps everyone happy. Because as long as that's working, it actually doesn't matter who's sitting on top of powerful ministries and controlling different fiefdoms, as long as everyone's getting fed.
That's what I mean by getting fed, yeah.
Yep, I'll try to be brief on the Myanmar update because I know we're running against time here. I'm reminded of a number of debates that I've been a part of, including together with Jake, as to whether Cambodia or Myanmar is the exceptional case and what's exceptional about each of them. And of course, the two countries, I think, are vying for the reputation as the epicenter of the epicenter. So there's that whole background story behind all of this as well. I think, without getting into all the details of what led to the developments on the Thai-Myanmar border at the start of the year, a wave of Chinese nationals being trafficked and, kind of Chinese pressure on the region, I think led to something that could have become a crackdown, but in fact, I think has become once again another instance of political theater. That's effectively what you've played out, and I think you are really hitting the nail on the head in saying that the earthquake really did result in this issue falling off the face of the earth around the scale of what's going on around Myawaddy and to the south of Myawaddy. Since February 20th until I think this number is as of May 13th, there have been 9,059 people brought out of scam centers between Myawaddy going down to the south around Taichung, Three Pagodas Pass, that area. Of these, there have been 8,132 repatriated. I think the interesting couple of points around this, though, are both Chinese and Thai police sources indicate that the total numbers in just Myawaddy are between 50 to 100,000. So that means that those who've been brought out represent about 9%, if you take the higher of those two numbers, of those that are just in that one area. And that doesn't include all the other places that you have scam centers across Myanmar. Of course, there's been some other measures that have been put in place by Thailand, cutting energy, cutting flows of different shipments of goods across the border, including diesel fuel that would have been used for the generators, some more restrictions on passing across the border. Those measures, though, have been largely defeated by the criminal networks. So you'll see what has happened is that the price of diesel fuel in all of the surrounding areas, even going all the way far up to the north in Wa territory, the Wa Department of Commerce actually put out a ban on selling diesel fuel outside of the Wa territory because the price surged so much that it was becoming unaffordable all the way up on the China border. So that gives you a sense of just how much fuel was being schlepped down to power all of the scam centers. So effectively, I think what the strategy of the Border Guard Force and the DKBA was to kind of shock and awe, bring a large number of people out very quickly, overwhelm the Thai system. They're still actually now working on repatriating that same batch of individuals, large numbers of Ethiopians. This, of course, I think highlights a silent humanitarian crisis that's going on across the region, and I think that is one thing that it's been demonstrated by what's gone on in Myanmar, but unfortunately it hasn't really been brought out, I think, enough in the international press. Every single day there are new people coming out and stories coming out about the types of torture, the types of mutilation, the types of just awful crimes that are being perpetrated against these poor victims inside of the scam centers. Even some of the individuals who went in knowing that it was a scam center are coming out telling stories about how if they didn't hit their target, they were locked in a cage with a live dog, with a wild dog, and had to spend 24 hours or more in that cage with the animal. So, you see where people are just going to be permanently harmed and traumatized by all of this. I don't think enough of those stories are getting out there. It's not being well documented. Of course, part of this relates to the lack of resources that are there to facilitate a good process of documenting all of this. Getting people out is not easy. It requires that the armed groups that are taking people into the detention centers go through the Myanmar military's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Something gets passed along to Thailand. The diplomatic mission comes down to the border, gets the person out, and within 24 hours, they're home. For a country like Ethiopia, where there's maybe 700-800 Ethiopians inside that are waiting to come out, that's extremely difficult, thinking about the resources involved in doing that, thinking about the fact that the only diplomatic mission that is in the region that can cover this is not even in Southeast Asia. They're having to do this from being based out of Japan. Similar things for countries like Uganda, which also was able to rescue some of its nationals, but again, it requires someone coming from a mission outside of the country, relatively limited connectivity here coming in to bring individuals out. And I think I mentioned earlier about, it's actually 39, not 38, but 39 different countries. You have a lot of countries in there. Namibia, no relationships in the region. And then you have Sierra Leone, Ghana. I mean, there's a lot of individuals from across Africa where there just aren't good mechanisms to bring these people out. And I think this also illustrates another trend and pattern that has gone on in that why were there so many Ethiopians? Well, the fact that Ethiopia really doesn't have much in terms of protections for its nationals overseas, there's not much in terms of safeguards that are there, it makes those individuals extremely vulnerable once they're trafficked in. And I think it's concerning to see that of those many people that have been brought out for more than 2 months now, they're just languishing in detention centers with minimal health care, minimal food, minimal nutrition, and even some efforts to re-recruit them back into scam centers while they're there in the recruitment. I think beyond the fact that most of what's happened in and around Myawaddy is political theater, you've also seen an expansion, a further expansion of scam centers in different parts of the country. Most notably, after the DKBA became one of the big engines for this, you're now seeing that a northern ethnic armed organization that's very close to the United Wa State Army, this is the Shan State Army North, also known as the Shan State Progressive Party, that's the political wing. They have started to host a lot of these scam centers quite distant from the China border. This is, places like Mongshu, places like Tanyang are now increasingly setting up scam centers. There were about 920 that were repatriated from Mongshu. This is over 200 kilometers to the south of the China border. This was roughly 10 or so days ago. That was the first big batch that has been repatriated from that particular town. So it does show that there's some reach of law enforcement into that area, but I think the general trend is more of a spread, and you now have 4 major militia groups that are involved, very powerful militia groups involved, in addition to the Myanmar military itself and the Myanmar military's border guard force, which is the key perpetrator here. So I think that gives you kind of a recap of some of what we're seeing in Myanmar.
Yeah, also in the immediate aftermath of all those shutdowns, I saw an explosion of ads on Telegram channels advertising that groups were trying to move from Myanmar to Cambodia, and in the following months we just saw huge expansion of building work on the Thai border where they would have become straight into. So everyone was already preparing to receive tens of thousands of those people.
Okay.
Last thing I'm just reminded of that highlights just how much it's not a crackdown. The Yatai IHG, which is under Chithu and is one of the most notorious of the operators there, opened up a new tourist attraction. Just about 2 weeks ago, it's a war park where you can go in and play war games inside a Shoikoko with armed security. So just to sort of give you a sense of how much impunity is actually there.
Okay, this is the last question. I know we could go on all day, but these people have places to be as well. So leave the last question for Dominic.
Dominic Fulda, Nick Asia. Following straight on from what you're saying, Jason, there's this huge problem about working out how many people are trafficked and how many people are not. You're talking about an industry in the state that is in Cambodia being discussed at cabinet level every week. If it's that percentage of their GDP, it's going on. As a business, it makes sense that you don't attract bad news. It's getting a lot of coverage, whatever you say, Jason. Basically, are they unloading the trafficked people along the border in Burma and out of Cambodia as well to consolidate this as a properly functioning industry that doesn't attract the negative publicity that you're talking about or that you would like to see? If that's the case, it's obviously much more dangerous because it's an entrenched industry that's less obvious. People aren't reporting it. And on that point, I don't want to be depressing, but we're looking at a panel of unfunded people.
Unemployed. You can
We
just say
are
unemployed.
looking at a very brave journalist who just told us that all her stories are getting spiked because editors are frightened to run them and the consequences. This is not a good outlook. So my question is, who do you think you're whistling to? Who is out there that is going to do anything about this problem? China is completely compromised. It doesn't know if it's helping or preventing. ASEAN is doing absolutely nothing, particularly in Thailand. The US, apart from Treasury, is completely uninterested in this. There's nothing in Trump's behavior to make you think that anything's going to change. And the UN is missing in action in Southeast Asia. So who do you think is going to do anything about this?
I'll take the trafficking side. There certainly is evidence that in pockets the industry is professionalizing. There are compounds that used to have reports of human rights abuses that no longer do. But in general and in mass, coercion still seems to be a significant part of the business model. Certainly it is correct to say that over the last few years, as awareness on this issue has gone up, that the likelihood that people are coming fully at unawares, like it's plausible that a large number of the people who are coming in today versus 3 or 4 years ago, that a larger percentage of them may know on some level what they're getting into. But that comes into the definition of what do we consider to be a trafficking victim. And technically, if you are forced to conduct any activity under duress, you are a trafficking victim. You're someone who's there. We'll speak about people in terms of forced criminality.
Yeah.
So.
Jason has to run to his next appointment. So thank you very much, Jason.
Thanks. Yeah. I think Jake's probably saying what I would have said on that question. So,
yeah. So yes, yes. The type of victim, the profile of victim is changing. Yes, the industry is professionalizing. Sadly, we're not seeing a decrease in the level, like overall decrease in the level of coercive force. The vast majority of people are still not allowed to leave compounds. The reports of horrific abuse is widespread, and so but in criminal industries around the world, from drug trafficking to illegal mining to illegal timber trade, what have you, the vast majority of the value chain is there under some form of limited agency, and so that's something that we should expect to continue throughout the continued upward growth curve of this industry. Maybe I'll see if Mark wants to add something from the trafficking perspective as well.
Justin, this is one of the things that we wrestle with because there are some notable exceptions to the dominant trend as Jake has depicted. I can think of a complete building in Phnom Penh that is the unnamed Crown building near the UK embassy that relies completely on voluntary foreign and Cambodian workers. So but trying to understand what makes that positive deviance. Why is that occurring and it's apparently successful? Is where we need more information, we need more journalism, we need more light on the subject, and that's where we're all looking at each other wondering who's going to do this.
But to your point, very rightly noted that this industry actually globally becomes more dangerous as trafficking becomes less visible. And one of the reasons that we know about this space is because of the trafficking victims. That's a key reason that we know about it. And actually, you know, you could make a good argument that we actually have better data today on the locations, the nodes, the modes of operating on this industry as opposed to the drug industry, which we've been working to combat for 70 years. You look at the mode of combating the drug industry as well, and a scorched earth response has yielded the primary impact of the people who are facing the abuse at the bottom of the value chain end up being the same people who get held criminally culpable, and you actually are seeing that same thing emerge in this space as well. But like my short answer to your question is like probably coerced labor is going to be involved in this industry for years to come. But as that goes underground and as the profit, the business model of this becomes more and more exposed, you are going to see an increasing number of professionalized labor force, and that is just going to lead to this industry's continued growth and more insidious in the global economy.
Yeah, the best example I can give of this just recently was like a couple of weeks ago. I was leaving the Golden Triangle, and as I was leaving the Golden Triangle, there was a group of Indian guys trying to get out, and they were in a massive panic because they were being charged overstays on their visa while they were trying to leave, and they didn't have the money to pay the overstays. They hadn't been allowed to leave a compound in this place for several months, so they thought that their bosses had been renewing their visas, and they had not. They told me, I kind of helped them out, and I tried to at least swap some money for them so they could pay in renminbi, because everything in the Golden Triangle is Chinese. But I was like trying to get this, like I was swapping numbers with these guys so that I could be like, okay, well if you can't get out, when I get back to the Thai side, I'll try and see if anyone can help you because it's clearly a trafficking thing. And then I was talking to them, and they were like, oh yeah, you know, we've been stuck in this place. Like most of them thought they were going to be working for Amazon, but they were like as accountants basically in Thailand, and then they were taken across into Laos. They had to spend all of their savings and all the money they had made scamming after they found out it was a scam center, buying their passports back so they could leave. What was insane about this is I was like, okay, they asked me, they assumed that I had also come out of a scam compound, because why else would you be there? Most people when they meet me in that area assume that I am a Ukrainian refugee, like the show of the bat. And I kept trying to explain I hadn't come from a scam compound. Then I said, I actually work in Cambodia. And they were like, oh my God, you work in Cambodia, that's so much more dangerous, everything's worse there. This guy in the group, he was being tortured every day in a compound there, so he voluntarily allowed himself to be sold to Laos because he was told the conditions would be better. And then they said, because here it's fine, we're safe. And I was like, well, you're not getting tortured, but you just told me you've been trapped in a building for 6 months and you had to buy your freedom with all of your money, and now you can't get out of the country. And that's your idea of safe? And this is how low the bar is. That people who are clearly, by any international description and definition, are being trafficked and abused and exploited, no longer see themselves as being trafficked and abused and exploited, because the next door country, like Cambodia, is so much worse. So where do you draw the line for who is being trafficked when they don't even consider themselves to be trafficked anymore? It's so hard to actually put a specific measure on the number of people who are trafficked versus not trafficked. And also, a load of those people in that group, as I know from talking to other people from their situation, you've been broken down so much by the fact you've been working in this place, you can't go home, you're not going to get a job anywhere else, now you know you can do this job. It's very much like how a lot of people are forced into working in the sex industry and then stay there because they're like, well, I guess this is me now, right? It's the same trajectory. So now you've got hundreds of thousands of people who will probably stay in that industry voluntarily, but they were trafficked in initially. So it's just the whole thing's one big grey area. But in terms of who actually cares and who's going to shut this down, it's become incredibly clear over the last 6 months that most of the large funders of any kind of efforts into counter-trafficking, not just only from the US, but the UK, other countries as well, are no longer interested in the trafficking element. The only part they may be interested in are the kind of security elements, the kind of like tackling China element, or kind of other sort of like large geopolitical ideas. So unfortunately, we're all having to frame all of our work as primarily geopolitical right now to get anyone to care about it. So that is the depressing answer, I'm afraid.
And on that dismal note, I want to thank Jake Sims for bringing this amazing report here. I hope we can put the QR code back up. QR code kunma. And so you can get a copy of the report if you want. The electronic version's right there. So I want to thank Jake for approaching the FCCT and encouraging us to have this event. I also want to thank Lindsay and I want Mark and of course Jason, who's already departed, for their expertise, for taking the time to come here, and really sort of, I think, shine a light into a very dark corner of a situation that is not getting better or getting worse, but the international community seems to somehow have moved on from it. And I think this is a call today to refocus our attention on what's happening and the glowing global threat that it poses. So thank you very much for coming. And obviously they'll be here for a little while after the panel if you want to come up and ask individual questions to them. Thank you so much.